Well, now that I finally finished talking about the National East, it's now time to talk about the recap of the National Central Division, which is the Louisville Saints, the Milwaukee Lakers, the Indianapolis Express, the Denver Miners, and of course, our new defending champion, Omaha Thunder, who I can't wait to talk about, but since they're the division winner, they're going to have to wait till the end. So now to talk about the worst team in the league, the Louisville Saints. Well. So soon, and we're finally at the worst team in the league, the Louisville Saints. Now to their defense, they're not just the worst team. They tied the Columbus Barons with the worst overall record at 2-16. But I'm sure if I look at their stats, Louisville is probably the worser of the two. And they do have the number one overall pick, so of course that doesn't help much either. So, how did the Louisville Saints get into such a hole? Well, they start off a franchise worst and National Conference worst 0-13. They were the second to last team to remain undefeated, and I think they overall had the second longest losing streak in PFA history now, losing 13 in a row. But then something incredible happened. They won 2 in a row. They beat Oakland Majors 14-12 at home thanks to the fact that Oakland had so many injuries on offense. And then this was a stunner. They actually went to the Atlanta Trojans and beat them 24-14. They didn't win by just like a slimmest of margin. They won in pretty good fashion too at their place. That was quite an impressive victory they did against Atlanta. But of course, they lost all the rest of their games to finish 2-16 and with the number 1 overall pick. So now let's get to the stats. On offense, they had the second to worst points scoring deep offense in the league, scoring just 14.3 points a game. That's god awful. 36 in yards, 29th in yards on the ground, and 35th pass offense. So their offense overall was dog shit. What else to say? But then there's a little surprising thing on defense. They were 23rd in points allowed, so like around middle of the pack. They were 12th best yards allowed defense. That's quite surprising for the number 1 team to be so high up. They were 19th in run defense, so that's around average, above average. And they had the 16th best pass defense, again, still slightly above average. So they had a pretty solid defense to some extent, especially if you consider like so many of their games were close and low scoring. And we're going to get to them pretty soon. So this team overall seems to be pretty good on the defense to some extent, but god-awful on offense. This team lost 9 games within a touchdown or less. Can you imagine how much better they would be if they just won even just half of those games? Their running back Justin Dowd had a solid season, getting almost 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns, so not a bad season for him. Then we get to the passing part, and the Louisville Saints were the first of a couple teams that actually had to do a quarterback change during the season due to bad performance. Their starting quarterback to start the year, Mark Latimer, had probably the worst tenure so far of all teams in PFA. 9 games he played, under 2,000 yards, completions of only 54%. Oh, God. 4 touchdowns, 13 picks, and a QB, I already said a QB rating. QB rating of 59.4, which I think is the second worst this entire season. Oh, jeez. But then his backup, Raymond Barron, who started the remaining 9 games, had thrown slightly less, just barely over 1,800 yards, but 8 touchdowns, 6 picks, a 57% completion percentage, and a QB rating of 76.4. Not good, but a lot better than what Latimer did. And although Barron probably set him up as a possible starter for next year, with that number 1 pick, the Saints have a lot of options to pick from, including there's a bunch of studs, looks like, this year in the 2017 draft for QBs. So maybe they'll use that number 1 pick to get the franchise quarterback. But although that offense was shitty, they had one big savior on offense, and that was their wide receiver, Scott Bueno, who had 79 receptions, almost 1,800 yards, but only 7 touchdowns. But he did get a shit ton of yards. That is very impressive. I think he's definitely within top 5 for the most yards this whole season. But then we get to the offensive line, and oh boy, it's mediocre. It's not really good at all. And that offensive line needs some major repairs to have any shot at contending next year. So they got to get that offensive line fixed too, along with getting a quarterback. Tackling, their linebacker Larry Mercier had 141, and their cornerback Daniel Gross had 2. So they had some pretty good tacklers. On defense, their defensive end Daniel Painter had 11 sacks. Not bad. And then when we get to interceptions, no real picks at all this year. Matter of fact, just 11 picks. 11 interceptions. That might be the lowest any team's gotten this year in terms of turnover. Well, not just turnovers, interceptions. Because, God, that defense had no pressure whatsoever. So the high notes, Scott Bueno, he'd had a very good year. Larry Mercier, their linebacker, had a very good year. That defense is pretty, well, I wouldn't say solid, but almost solid. And if they get a couple pieces right, maybe they can get this team right again and back into shape. They lost 9 close games within a touchdown, so they were in a lot of games till the very end when they blew it. And, of course, those 2 wins, especially that one win at Atlanta, that was a strange win, but they managed to pull it off there. And that last game of the year where they led Omaha 15-14, I think they went up 15-0 at one point, before they let the Thunder come back to win the game by a lot. So that was the highlights there. But the lowlights, oh God, all over the place. Well, one being starting off 0-13 and getting this number 1 overall pick, that's definitely not good. But a lot of those losses, they allowed comebacks. They allowed the comeback against Denver when they were up 19-10, and then they allowed Denver to score 17 unanswered points to win the game. They led Milwaukee when they hosted them 20-7 and allowed Milwaukee to come back to win by 1. They had a 5-point lead against the Washington Americans, and they blew that loss by 1. And of course, the just mentioned loss against Omaha when they were up 15-something at one point, and they allowed them to come back to win the game. They had to do a comeback against Indianapolis. They blew that. They had to do a comeback against Denver, and they blew that too. So many games that this team blew that they probably should have won. So what does this team need to do? Well, with that number 1 overall pick, they probably should go get a quarterback. And then they got to fix that terrible offensive line. They got to get better on the front 4 and secondary. You can't have just 11 interceptions. That's god-awful. Especially when you're in a division that has Marchie Arvin and Zachary Ellis. That's unacceptable. Now, will they get everything correct? Maybe, maybe not. But being number 1 pick overall, though, that will help. But being 2-16, though, that should pretty much be a guarantee that they're going to improve. Because how can you get any worse? Going 2-16 again, or going 1-17 or 0-18? That's very unlikely. So Louisville Saints should definitely do better in 2017. Well, next up is the Milwaukee Lakers, who had a really strange year. Remember, this team started 3-0, then they got boat race toast in Birmingham. However, they recovered to win 3 in a row, so now they're at 6-1. But then all of a sudden, they went on to lose all the rest of their games except for Week 19 hosting Omaha, where they absolutely dominated them. And you would think maybe the quarterback play was terrible. Well, they did have a quarterback substitution, but that was because of injury. And not only that, both quarterbacks did very good. Both of them had over a 90% QB rating, so they did play good. So what the hell happened to Milwaukee to collapse so badly? You don't go 6-1 and all of a sudden go 1-10. So as we look at their stats, on offense, they were 28th in scoring, so that's definitely not good. They were 22nd in yards, which is around average. They were 35th in run offense. That's definitely not good, just barely getting under 102 yards a game. But they were the 7th best pass offense in the league, so there's something very good for them, even with going through 2 QBs this year. But oh boy, then we get to the defense, and this is where it probably gets obvious. They were 32nd in points defense, so they allowed way too many points. They were 33rd against the in yards. That's not good. 37th in run defense. They were the 4th worst rush defense in the league and 23rd in pass defense. So around average there. So maybe that's one reason why they lost. They had offense that got a lot of yards but did not get a lot of points off of it. And they had defense that allowed so many yards. And I look at their schedule, they did lose 4 games where they were within a touchdown or less of winning. So they could have turned around and went 11-7. But that still probably would not have been enough to clinch a playoff spot. But it still would have been a lot better situation than they were in. And now I look at their schedule too. Only 3 of their wins, of their 7 wins, were blowouts. The rest were close games. And 3 of them, just 3 games are teams with winning records, including Omaha. So it looks like the majority of their wins came from losing teams, including sweeping Omaha and sleeping Manhattan. So now we get to their stats, and first in passing, as their main starting quarterback, Herman McLendon, who went down 7 weeks due to injury. He was 222 of 330, so a 67 completion percentage, very good. Almost 2,600 yards, 15 touchdowns and 7 interceptions to get almost a 97 quarterback rating. And his backup, John Addison, had almost 64% completion, almost 1,800 yards, 13 touchdowns, 9 picks, and a QB rating of 96%. In 7 games. So they both did pretty good, although they did not throw that many touchdowns. So that may explain one reason why they didn't win so many games, because they didn't get much points. But then their running back, Steven Salisbury, had over 330 attempts. Over 1,400 yards and 10 touchdowns. He had a really good season. Their wide receiver, James Holt, got over 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns, but remember, this is 18 games, so it's not really that big of impressive. And their second receiver, Edward Williams, had over 800 yards and 7 touchdowns, so not really good in the receiving category. Then we get to the offensive line, which was very good. Probably one of the, maybe top 10 best offensive lines in the league. Every position except maybe one of their tackles did a very good job. Then we get to defense with their linebacker, Richard Herron, having 185 tackles. I think he was the second most in the league. That is impressive. 2 sacks and a pick, too. But other than that, no one had over 100 tackles. Then we get the sacks. They had total 41 sacks, which sounds pretty impressive, but this is 18 games, so it's probably not that big of a deal. And they had no 10-sack leader. And on picks, they had their cornerback, Leon Gant, had 6 picks, so he had a good year. But overall, this team had only 17 picks, which is definitely not good, considering that almost half of them came from one player. So this team had good QBs that did not throw that many touchdowns, though. A running back that didn't get many touchdowns. 2 wide receivers that did not get any real yards or touchdowns. They have a very strong offensive line, a very good linebacker, a very good cornerback, but nothing else. And I guess that explains why they went 7-11. Their highlights? Well, beating Omaha at home 31-9 is very good, especially considering the fact they almost beat them many weeks earlier, where Omaha had to score a game-tying touchdown with like 42 seconds remaining on a 42-yard pass before winning in overtime. So they were 1-1 against Omaha, the current champion, and almost swept them. So that's pretty good news. And they did do good job against Denver and Miami, 2 other playoff teams this year. But then you get to the lowlights. That one loss, they were hosting Buffalo. They were leading 21-3 going to halftime, and they allowed Buffalo to get the game-winning touchdown with just 48 seconds left to win 25-21. That was definitely bad. Losing to Omaha with that big lead that they blew, that was really bad. They got swept by Indianapolis. And, of course, going overall 6-1 to start the year and then 7-11. That's definitely a very big disappointment. So what does this team need to do? Probably get a receiver. Maybe get another running back. And patch up that defense. That team was good enough to match up against Omaha twice. They should make some minor fixes to compete against them next year. But the way they finished, 1-10... I don't think they're going to be able to do it, though. I think they're going to regress big time next year unless they get those things patched up. So we'll see what they do in the offseason. After that, it was the Indianapolis Express, who went pretty much the exact opposite of the Milwaukee Lakers. They started off 0-4. Then they won their first game at Orlando. Then they went on to lose 6 in a row to start off 1-10. They look like one of the worst teams in the league. But then all of a sudden, they would go 6-1 in their final games to finish 7-11. An exact reverse of what Milwaukee did. They started off 6-1 and then they went 1-10 the rest of the way. But on offense, they definitely looked a lot better than Milwaukee. But on defense, not so much, although stats might look a little better. So as we look at the stats, on offense, they were 32nd in scoring, so that's not good. But they were 16th in yards, so they got a lot of yards, but not a lot of points off it. They were 23rd in rush offense, so that's around average. 14th best pass offense in the league. So they were pretty good at passing, but again, they still didn't get a lot of points, only 19 points. Then on defense, they were 24th in scoring defense, so that's around the average. They were 32nd in yard defense, so that's definitely not good. But they were 13th in run defense. They were good, pretty solid stopping the run. But they were 37th in pass defense, so they did allow a lot of teams to get a shit ton of yards on them. So wow, Indianapolis is all over the place with this shit. Their quarterback Rodney Sanders has almost 64% completion percentage, 4,200 yards, 24 touchdowns and 12 picks. He struggled at the beginning of the year, but eventually turned around and have a pretty solid year with a QB rating of 92.8. And of course, on the running game, they were the best at it on their team. Kevin Smith, their running back, had over almost 1,600 yards and 11 touchdowns. He had a great season there. They had 2 very good studs at wide receiver. Robert Monaghan had over 119 receptions, almost 1,500 yards, but he only got 7 touchdowns, so that really hurt. And then the other receiver, Kevin Ivey, had 80 catches, over 1,350 yards, but only 6 touchdowns. So they did get a lot of yards and receptions, but not a lot of touchdowns. This team's offensive line is very good, especially having one of the best offensive tackles in the league, John Johnson, who was their #1 overall pick, remember. He had 63 pancakes, and allowed just 3 sacks. That's very good. They had 2 very good tacklers, and Frank Carr, his linebacker, he got over 152 tackles, and their strong safety, Otis Moses, had 108 tackles, so he had a good season, plus Moses had 2 picks along with it. This team got a lot of pressure on defense, with Sean Turley, their defensive end, getting 11 sacks, and their linebacker, Michael Buffington, getting 10 sacks. That's pretty good, especially since everyone else had a decent amount of sacks. This was a very sack-friendly team. However, this team was not good at all when it came to interceptions. Their leading interceptor was Dustin Williams, their free safety. Just free. 10 total. That is absolutely horrendous. No wonder this team finished 7-11 with that terrible secondary. So some highlights would be they did have a lot of good players, particularly on offense. They got 2 wide receivers, a running back, and a quarterback that are very good. And they did have that really good finish at the end of the year when they went 6-1. They did that come-from-behind victory against Denver on Sunday night. That was really good. And then they did beat Los Angeles Angels at their place in a pretty decent fashion, so that was very good for them. This team overall beat 3 teams with winning records, including 2 teams that would make it to the playoffs, so that was very good for them. But of course, starting off 1-10 and finishing 7-11, that is disastrous, especially when you lost that 35-7 thrashing when you hosted Philadelphia many weeks ago in the season. That was pretty disastrous. And the only thing I see this team really doing to fix themselves is draft a really good corner or safety for that first overall, with that 14th overall pick. But who knows how that will work out. But overall, I do think this team will get better next year. But where is the question? Because that's going to be a very difficult division to improve on. Well, now we get to one of the wild card teams and one of the more lucky ones this year. And that was the Denver Miners. Oh boy, this team had one hell of an up and down season. Remember, they lost their first game to get absolutely destroyed by Chicago. Then they won 2 in a row. Then they lost another one. Then during their game against Louisville when they were down 19-10, their quarterback at the time went down to injury, and then came in Zachary Ellis to lead a team to come back to get back to 3-2. And thanks to his leadership and good passing skills, At one point, they were 7-7. They made all the way to 7-6. Then they lost that disastrous game Sunday night at Indianapolis when they let them get a 14-point comeback, I believe it was. But after that, they would go on to win 4 in a row, including the decisive last game of the year hosting Portland, where they absolutely dominated them 38-14 to clinch the last playoff spot in the National Conference, only to lose to Birmingham in the wildcard round 13-9. So, wow, let's talk about the stats. This team was the 4th best scoring offense in the league. That's incredible. The 6th best offense in terms of getting yards. That's really good. They were the 6th best team in rushing offense and the 10th best in pass offense. So this team was excellent on offense all across the board. They got a whole bunch of yards and they got a whole bunch of points too. But then we get to the defense. They were 29th in scoring defense. That's terrible. They were 34th in yards. That's horrible. Matter of fact, they even allowed more yards than they gained yards. That's incredible how horrendous their defense was there. 32nd in rush defense. That's absolutely terrible. And 32nd in pass defense. Again, horrendous. Matter of fact, they allowed more passing yards than they got passing yards too. It is incredible how this team went 11-7, made the playoffs too, the way that defense is. That defense needs a lot, and I mean a lot of work. So now we get into the quarterback comparisons. First, their starter for the beginning of the season was Kevin Balak. He started 5 games. He threw slightly under 1,000 yards. He had a completion percentage of barely 52%, 4 touchdowns, 9 picks, with a QB rating of under 60. So that's god-awful. But then Zachary Ellis came in, and holy shit, what a turnaround this was. Almost 3,300 yards, 29 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, a QB rating of 102.6, plus a 64% completion percentage. Plus, he was a running QB, so we got 200 yards and no touchdowns off it, though. So he was a dual-threat quarterback, and he really, really did good. In fact, remember, there was a 2-week stretch where he got 9 touchdowns. That was probably the best of any quarterback's ever done in this league in that 2-game stretch. What an incredible season he had, and he could be an MVP candidate the way he performed, although it's going to hurt that he missed 5 games. This team had a very strong running game, but they didn't have a good leader on that side of the ball. Their leading rusher was Kevin Teeter, who, although only started 4 games, he played all of them and got slightly over 1,100 yards and 10 touchdowns. And right behind him was the guy who started the rest of the games, Robert Avies, or whatever, had under 700 yards but just 2 touchdowns. So this team overall had 4 players get over 200 yards. So this team did get a lot of yards, but no one really being that impressive. On the receiving end, their wide receiver Sol Harmon had 81 catches, almost 1,350 yards, and 11 touchdowns. And right behind him was Carl Thompson, who got over 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns. And he might have gotten more if he didn't miss the final 3 games of the season. If he didn't miss 3 games for the year. And oh my God, as we keep going through this division, it's good offense after good offense. The Denver Miners might have had the best offensive line of any team in the league right now. They allowed, looks like, under 20 sacks the entire season, and their starters on offense are all very, very good. On defense, they only had one 100 tackler, and that was their linebacker, Dale Ramey, who had 121 tackles. But you're not going to believe this. The Denver Miners, despite having such a terrible defense, they tied Oakland, and I can't remember the other team, for the second most sacks this season. They had 66, including 4 sacks, or means 4 players that have 10 plus sacks. Their defensive tackle, James Hoover, 15 sacks. Their defensive end, Craig Early, 15 sacks. Their other defensive end, Virgin Hall, 12 sacks or 11 sacks. And their other defensive tackle, Scott Herney, 10 sacks. They got a lot of pressure, but unfortunately it didn't translate to lower points. And that's probably also hurt by the fact that they only had, I think it was like 13 picks total this entire season. and their leader in sacks was their cornerback Robert McManus, who only had 5 picks. So a team that didn't get a lot of tackles probably got a shit ton of sacks, but no picks at all. So that's definitely not good. The highlights, well, of course, finding Zachary Ellis was a big gem. Can you imagine how bad this team would be if they were still starting the other guy? Oh boy, that 4-game winning streak to end of the year was very impressive. That incredible offense was very good. They had that comeback from behind victory against Louisville when they were down 19-10 at one point. That was very big. And they had two very close games against Omaha, who would go on to win the championship. That was very good. But then, of course, the lowlights. Well, starting off, they lost against Milwaukee when they were up 20-3, and they blew that game. They blew it both times against Omaha. Matter of fact, one game against Omaha, I think they were up 27-14. They blew that. They did blow it against Indianapolis when they were down. They were up 23-10, and then they went on to lose 24-23. So they had a lot of games where they did blow very badly. And if they won all those games, along with beating Omaha twice, they might have clinched home field advantage for all we know. But of course, we'll never know. So what does this team need to do? Well, they gotta fix that defense, that secondary particularly. Maybe get another linebacker, because that 11 picks or whatever, that is horrendous. You can't have that happen again. Maybe get another running back and receiver to help give Zachary Ellis some more help on offense and more firepower. Maybe get another linebacker. I think I already said that too, to help get more tackles, but everything else seems to be fine at the moment. This team, if they can get that defense fixed, this team could be a major threat next year, and maybe a possible PFA Bowl contender. Well, now we finally get to the team I wanted to talk about the most. The first ever PFA champion, the Omaha Thunder. What an incredible team they were. Remember, they started off a franchise best, conference best, and league best 14-0. 14-0, just think about that for a second. 14-0. But then, not only would they lose 3 straight, but all those games they would get absolutely destroyed, and they collapsed to 14-3. And all they had to do was win one more game to clinch home field advantage. And if they didn't, and Washington wins, they would blow it and let Washington have the home field advantage. And that final game of the year against the Louisville Saints, down 12. They start off 12-0. Then they were down 15-7. They went on to score 25 unanswered points to win 32-15 to go 15-3 and clinched home field advantage. They then barely beat the incredibly strong Los Angeles Angels in that 34-31 crazy game. And then they hosted the Washington Americans in the conference championship, where they won 17-0 in a defensive shootout. And then finally in PFA Bowl 1, they absolutely destroyed the Chicago 71ers 35-9, although they did struggle on offense in that game, to become the first ever PFA champs. This team has the #1 scoring offense of all time now. They scored 26.7 points a game, which translates to scoring 480 points a game. And if they didn't screw up in those last 3 games they lost, can you imagine if they could have hit 500 points? That would have been absolutely something. They had the 4th best yards offense in the league. They had the 19th best rush offense in the league, so that shows probably their biggest weakness. But they were the 3rd best pass offense in the league, getting over 258 yards a game. Defense, they were the 9th best scoring defense in the league, so they did a very good job holding down many points. 6th best in yards defense, very good for them. They were 14th in running defense, which is pretty average. And then they were the 8th best pass defense, which had a very good sign for them. So this team overall was very good, although their weaknesses on the running side of the ball did hurt. So we take a look at the stats now, and we'll start with possible MVP contender, Archie Marvin, their quarterback, throwing over 4,400 yards, 32 touchdowns, just 10 picks, for a QB rating of 98.2, which is not as good as everyone else. That's not even probably, I think, top 10, but that still was one hell of a year. Mark Metz, their running back, over 1,600 yards this season and an incredible 17 touchdowns. I think he leads the league of running backs at the most touchdowns in a season. I'm going to have to look that up later. But even so, 17 touchdowns and 1,600 yards. That is absolutely incredible. Steve Carmona, Archie Marvin's biggest receiver, had almost 1,800 yards and 2 touchdowns. And, of course, their other wide receiver, Edwin Soto, had over 100 receptions, almost 1,100 yards, but just 4 touchdowns. And their tight end, Juan Salcido, also was very crucial, making almost 100 catches, almost 800 yards, and 7 touchdowns. So they had 3 big receivers that really helped them this year. However, on offensive line, it was only solid, so they got a lot of work to do on that. Because they can't have that really powerful offense lacking, means slowing down with that potency. And then on defense, you had their linebacker, Christopher Miller, having over 126 tackles, and their cornerback, Donald Brennan, having 102 tackles. And on sacks, this team was actually average when it came to sacks, but Walter Horner had 14 sacks, and their defensive tackle, William Borges, had 11 sacks. So those two had very good seasons. And then on interceptions, they did get a lot of interceptions, but they didn't have anyone that really got a shit ton of interceptions. Their leader was William Vicker, who had 4 interceptions. So no one really good on the secondary, although they did get a lot of interceptions in total. So the highlights, oh man, there's a whole bunch of them. Going 14-0, number 1 offense in the league, finishing 15-3, which is the best record ever, and going all the way to the PFA Bowl to become the first ever champions. That's nothing but highlights. But there were some lowlights, of course. Those 2 wins against Denver were very close. That should not probably have gone down like that. Their biggest and almost closest to losing in the beginning of the season before they lost was when they were hosting Milwaukee. They were down 21-14 with just under a minute left, and they were at midfield almost. And Mark Metz had a 42-yard run to get game tying touchdown with just 47 seconds remaining before they finally won the game in overtime. But then those last 3 games of the year, well, not last, at New Orleans, Boston, and Milwaukee, they lost to New Orleans 27-14. That's bad. They lost to Boston 35-10. That's even worse. They lost to Milwaukee 31-9, a team that was terrible and on a 9-game losing streak, I believe it was. And that gave them their only win for the rest of the season. That is terrible. And remember, they were down by only Louisville near the end of the season, who was the worst team on the field this year. So that's not really good highlights. But hey, they went 15-3, started 14-0. They made it all the way to the PFA Bowl and won it. So in the end, it was a very good season for them. What do they need to do on offense? The draft this year, they need to patch up that offensive line to ensure Archie Marvin and company don't get struggling this year. And they got to fix that defense. It was pretty solid, but solid's not going to be enough. You have to get a very strong defense if you want to have any shot of being like a dynasty or even have a shot to repeat next year, because everyone's going to have their eyes on Omaha this year, next coming season. But unfortunately, as with most in real life when it comes to Super Bowl competitors, I think they are going to regress a little bit next season. They're already 15-3, which would be equivalent to 13-3 in the NFL. It's not easy to maintain a 13-3 record straight or do better than next year. It's almost always a regression. So if they get everything right, maybe they won't regress at all, or maybe they'll do even better. But if they fuck up, they might regress big time, where Denver might even take over for the division title next year. Maybe Omaha might go into the wild card round. So we'll have to see about that. But we'll see what happens. But anyways, congratulations still to the Omaha Thunder for clinching their first ever PFA Bowl title. I can't wait to see what they do next year along with the rest of this division. It's going to be very interesting. And now up soon will be the next video, which I'll talk about the National South.